sure that gets
That's why it's good.
Yeah, well, I wasn't done yet, so. All right, let's start over again. Let's make sure this isn't fuzzy. All right, well, as Tim said, thank you so much for the introduction. It's fantastic to be here. Cornbread Catholic as a concept, I think, is just fantastic. It captures so much about the South and the richness of the heritage and the tradition of the church in the South. But I think it's also something that it creates a kind of wonder and joy that comes from it. And I think that's one of the things that we really need to reclaim in the culture these days. But when Tim asked me to speak about this, I forgot the book, but do you mind holding up my book just so that people can see it? It will be available for purchase afterwards. Tim asked me to talk about my book called The Marian Option. And I wrote this book about 10 years ago, and it was around the time that Rod Dreher wrote his great book, The Benedict Option. And I had actually given a talk at Acton University on the Benedict Option. And the more that I talked about it, I was like, you know what, the Benedict Option is great. We need to go deeper in our communities and thicken them up and really go deeper into our faith and tradition. But it's missing something, and it's missing something that's actually, I think, better than the Benedict Option, and that's really the Marian Option. And so I wrote this book, and I think around the same time there were several other books that were on the same topic. One was by Archbishop Chaput, and then there was another one by Anthony Eslin. And I'm very proud to say that none of them actually included Our Lady as a major theme in any of their books. So it felt like a very, just a beautiful gift to be given to Our Lady to really start spreading the message about how we know and understand her to be the mediator, that it wants to help us in the times today. But it's not enough to just say that. I think in this book, The Marian Option, I go through and explain kind of a big picture look at history and how it is that Our Lady has helped us in so many different ways, especially in the last 1,000 years in particular. And I'm going to talk about a little bit of that in a minute. But I want to kind of just give you a sense of how I'm going to go about unpacking this. And the first thing I want to do, it's going to be 3 parts. The first thing I want to do is talk about how it is that we got so hollowed out as a culture in the last 100 years. I think this is a really important piece because we obviously know it's a crisis of faith, but why did we end up in this crisis of faith? And it's easier to navigate out of something if you know how you got into the mess in the first place. So that's going to be the first thing I'm going to talk about. The second thing is really to look at how Our Lady is such an incredible means to help us out of the mess that we have created and that we're currently living in. And then the third thing I want to do is just talk about how we can finally just there are practical things that we can do in our own lives to really start helping Our Lady and allowing her to help us to live out this mission. So the first thing is, how did we get to this point? I want to talk about 3 different thinkers from the last century who had just incredible insights into what happens with cultures. How do cultures grow and how do cultures die? The first one was a man named J.D. Unwin, and J.D. Unwin wrote in the 1930s, and he wasn't Catholic. He wasn't really even Christian. I think he called himself an agnostic, and he was a sociologist, and he studied 80-plus civilizations that had all decayed and been eliminated. And he said when he was doing his studies, there was one thing that he encountered in all of them that he said he could pinpoint the very moment when they had reached their apex and they were going to start decaying. There was one indicator. And that indicator was when the culture stopped the prohibition against premarital sex. When monogamy went the way of all flesh, so to speak, and people ended up being very promiscuous, that was really the turning point in the culture. And he said he saw it so readily that he didn't know when he was researching these cultures whether to laugh or cry, because he knew exactly what was going to happen to them after this point happened in their culture. So if you look at our culture, of course, we can kind of go back to, I would say, a generous place would be 1960s or 70s when premarital sex and the prohibition against it was abandoned. But the thing that Unwin said that he also found was that you have 3 generations after that point in which the civilization will just unravel. You've got about 100 years for the culture to actually remain intact, and then something else will have to replace it. What's curious is none of these cultures had social media. None of them had, the internet and all of the things that come with that. So it wouldn't be surprising if his 3 generations conjecture was maybe condensed a little bit and was happening more quickly. So that's the first one, J.D. Unwin. The second person who I found really interesting in terms of understanding our situation was another historian named Arnold Toynbee. And Toynbee was writing predominantly in the 1950s and 60s. And his main idea was the civilizations aren't murdered, but they commit suicide. And again, it's very much connected to this idea of Unwin's, that you start hollowing out the culture because you're spending all of this time doing other things. And actually, this is one of the interesting points about Unwin's observation was, well, why is it that premarital sex and the abandonment of monogamy is so important? Well, if you look around, you can see it's basically a question of economy and building. What's abandoned when you abandon monogamy is the amount of time that you save in being married and focused on building something. And suddenly when that's all gone, people are spending all kinds of time on relationships they're in, relationships they shouldn't be in, relationships they're having, relationships they're pursuing, relationships that they're breaking up, and then of course the children that are a result of that and how to navigate that, which is obviously such an issue in our own culture. So Toynbee is really, reiterating or emphasizing what Unwin already saw, that there is the sense of civilizations committing suicide and dying from within. There's a third person that you may not have heard of. He's new to me recently. His name is Augusto Del Noce, and he was an Italian philosopher. And in 1970, he wrote an article basically talking about what had happened with Marxism. And of course, in 1970, he's looking back and he's seeing what's happened with communism. He's seeing the socialists and the Nazis. He's seeing Mao's China. He's seeing this incredible spread of communism. But he says something has changed because all of these efforts, whether it was the Soviets or the Nazis or Mao's China, all of them infiltrated the culture very violently. You could tell, you knew that point at which the communists were coming and when they were trying to take over the civilization. And Del Noce wisely said, they're not done yet. This Marxist ideology hasn't been exhausted yet. They're going to just morph into something else, and we have to be on guard for it and really recognize how it is that they're going to try to attack us next. And this is, I think what's fascinating is he saw, as early as 1970, that it was going to come to the United States, but it wasn't going to come in these vicious, vile, awful battles and wars where people are starving and hungry and bodies are everywhere. It was going to come in a very tidy, pretty packaging. And he basically says the West will be saturated and drowned in sugary water. And he points back to this another thinker named Wilhelm Reich. And Wilhelm Reich was part of the Frankfurt School. He was writing in 1936. He wrote a book called The Sexual Revolution. And in this book, Reich points out and basically takes Marxist ideas, and he says we need to shift the arguments from class warfare to then having it be between men and women, and we need to have families really implode because of the fact that we don't want, he's trying to infuse the ideas of Freud. We want people to be liberated in their sexuality and feel like if you do anything to suppress your sexuality and to try to order it or restrain it, that you're really destroying yourself. And what we want is this open liberation of sexuality and for every expression of every desire to find a place in the culture and to be look down upon any kind of repression or restraint or sexual integrity. And, of course, he's writing this in 1936, and I'm sure people thought it was crazy, and he ended up being jailed for something like child abuse or something. I can't remember the details, but Reich's ideas lived on, and this is exactly what happened in the 60s and 70s, was the embodiment of Reich's ideas. So this is where we're at this point, is that we've absorbed completely these ideas of Reich and really hollowed out our own culture because of the fact that we've abandoned monogamy entirely. And of course, the effects have been so dramatic on the family, on relationships between men and women. And this is also part of the packaging was there was an intentional effort to make women victims and men victimizers. This was intentionally injected into the culture. And as a result, this is what's created all of this tension and this idea that men and women, marriage isn't meant to be something long-term. It's sort of ephemeral and can sort of look in any way you want it to. And obviously we see what's happened with it with gay marriage. But this idea of women as victims and men as victimizers, even though a woman may never have experienced any victimization in her life, and a man may never have done anything to victimize people, that's the idea that was pushed into the culture, that this Marxist idea that we're now living with and trying to flesh out and understand, what's going on and how do we actually get rid of it, because we've finally seen the fruits of it are just a disaster. So what's the hope then? How do we navigate this in light of the fact that we have this widespread rot going on? And this is where Toynbee comes in again. He had this, what he saw in his research was that whenever you had a culture that was decaying, there was usually a core group of people that were very small, and it was through either prayer, like someone like Saint Benedict, who doused himself in prayer, 3 years in prayer, and then came out and created the monastic system, or something that became a more popular idea that people then, it spread like wildfire. And I think we're seeing both of those things happen in the culture today. Toynbee actually says of creative minorities, he calls them no more than leavening in the lump of humanity. So these are very small groups, and they have the capacity to transform the culture because they're actually building while the rest of the culture is decaying. And that's the beauty of, I think, a reason why we ought to have much hope is that it doesn't take a lot of people for this to happen. Of course, we can look at Jesus and the 12 disciples. St. Benedict, as I mentioned, is another one. St. Dominic and the Rosary. There's always that great joke about how when the Dominicans were started, they were fighting the Albigensians. And of course, nobody knows what Albigensian is anymore. And meanwhile, the Jesuits were about fighting the Protestants. And, well, we all know what Protestants are. So, in any event, these are small groups. But, and this takes me to the second point, in the last 1,000 years, if you look at the creative minorities that have existed, most of them have been around Our Lady. Our Lady has been the one to prompt them, to stir them, to really make dramatic changes in the culture. And of course, we know that Our Lady is our mother. She was obviously given to us on the cross. Most of us have heard about her apparitions and the many ways in which she's appeared over the years. And it's really interesting to, one of the things I did in this book was just take these huge chunks of time and put them together and sort of start seeing where do the threads lead from point A to point B. And one of my favorites was to just really look at what happened with Our Lady of Guadalupe, kind of as a median point. What most people don't know about Our Lady of Guadalupe is that the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe actually starts in 711 in Spain. So in 711, the Moors, Islamic invaders from North Africa, invade Spain, and they take over the whole peninsula. And at this point, the Spaniards are trying to fight back. They're trying to win back their country, and nothing is working. They're having very little success. The Moors keep taking up more and more land, and nothing is going well. So eventually, there's one man who's in a battle, and the year is 1003. And he says, I'm going to fight under the banner of Our Lady. They had tried other saints and other devotions prior to that, and nothing was working. So he finally fights under the banner of Our Lady, and he wins. And so suddenly everybody in Spain starts fighting under the banner of Our Lady because they knew she was effective. So in the year 1492, after 781 years of occupation, the very last battle happens where the Moors are finally pushed out of the peninsula of Spain. It's no accident that the year 1492 sounds familiar to you, because of course that's the year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Because what happened was that as the last Moors are pushed out, Ferdinand and Isabella feel like we've got to keep evangelizing. We have to keep looking. We've got to keep spreading the faith in any way that we can. And so it's at that point that this obscure sailor named Christopher Columbus is called upon and sent out to sail the ocean blue. And one of the things that I found most fascinating was just the depth of faith that Christopher Columbus had. This is something that you don't really hear about on Columbus Day. But all the places that they went, most of them he actually named with some kind of Marian title. Many of them didn't stick, but several of them did. And they were very intent in the devotion to Our Lady. One of the ships was called the La Nina for Our Lady. It was a very special thing to them, to he and the sailors. And the defining moment in terms of my understanding of this whole process was they're on their way back after the first voyage back to Spain, and this big storm comes up. And they're praying everything to try and stop this storm because they know it's going to be, they could all lose their lives. And finally, they all agreed that if they survived the storm, they would all make a pilgrimage to this very special site called Our Lady of Guadalupe. Now, I would say that, Our Lady of Guadalupe, and you're thinking Mexico. Well, it turns out there's actually a different image of Our Lady of Guadalupe that goes back to 1326. There was a Guadalupe River in Moorish Spain, where one day after this area was liberated, there was a farmer out, and the most beautiful lady he'd ever seen came to him and said, I need you to go tell a priest that there is an image of me buried here, and I want a church built on the site. So sure enough, the farmer goes and tells the priest, and the priest and the farmer go and find this strong box that inside of it has an image of Our Lady of Guadalupe that also includes a description of what it is, and apparently it was an image painted by St. Luke. So as the Moors were coming in, somebody had the presence of mind to take this treasure and bury it in a place that nobody would find it and it wouldn't be disturbed. So finally, in 1326, it's found, and this devotion had spread sufficiently that Christopher Columbus and his colleagues, or the other sailors, all knew about it. And so they get back to Spain, just reporting this whole new country and the potential riches and, experiences that they just had. And what do? They immediately, they spend hardly any time back in Seville, and they immediately go to walk barefoot to Our Lady of Guadalupe shrine in thanksgiving for their lives being spared. So that's all happening on the continent of Spain. Then, of course, we have the Protestant Reformation in 1530. Henry VIII is decided he wants more than one wife. We all know the result of that. And so while England is breaking away from the Catholic Church, what is Our Lady doing? She has seeded a whole new area of Catholics. Prior to the 1530s, there had been many Franciscans who were there trying to convert the Aztecs, who had obviously been, polygamous and involved in child sacrifice and just incredibly bloody civilization. And nothing was working. So then, of course, in 1531, we all know the story of Juan Diego walking up Tepeyac Hill. And this is where he meets the Virgin, Our Lady. And what's interesting is that Tepeyac Hill previously had actually been a site of goddess worship. So, and this is one of the amazing things, is there's never any wasted details with Our Lady. And everything is so rich and layered and multifaceted. It's really remarkable when you start looking into the specifics of it all. So the next thing, of course, is that eventually Juan Diego's not making any traction with the bishop, and that's when Our Lady gives him his tilma full of roses, and he takes them to the bishop, and the bishop's amazed first by the roses, and then, of course, he drops the roses, and there's the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. But what's interesting is that, again, you have this, she's this great multitasker, because when she tells him she's Our Lady of Guadalupe, the Spanish already know who Our Lady of Guadalupe is. There's nothing new about that to them. But the word Guadalupe is also very similar to an Aztec word, which was Coatlope. Sorry, my Aztec isn't very good. But Coatlope means the one who steps on snakes. So you can see how the Spanish are hearing something familiar and know who this woman is. And then you hear the Aztecs are, astounded because who is Our Lady? The one who steps on the snakes. But there's also so much in the image itself. The Europeans, the Spaniards, saw just a beautiful woman that they were already familiar with. The Aztecs didn't have a written language, but they used symbols to explain ideas. And so there's fabulous books that have been done on this, and that I've borrowed from. I'd love to say this was all my own research, but it's just amazing how deep it goes, and all the science and technology they've used to analyze the tilma. But what's amazing is that there's the symbols in Our Lady of Guadalupe are pointing to who she is. So she has her hair down, which in their culture meant that she was a virgin. She has a bow around her waist, I think, that indicated that she was not a goddess. Maybe I've inverted those. But it was clear to them that she was not a goddess. But then there was an image of a little flower right on her stomach. And that's the image of God for the Aztecs. And so they could tell, and she's of course visibly pregnant, so they could tell that God was in her stomach, and she was not a goddess, but she was a virgin and a mother. So they can read all of this instantaneously in that image, in a way that they're getting the same message the Spaniards already understood just from their own history. So the story doesn't end there, because then we go back to Europe in the year 1571. There's the Battle of Lepanto. And of course, we all know the Battle of Lepanto was, the Christian troops were outnumbered, and this was going to be this naval battle, and it was just going to be a rout for the Christians against the Turkish army, Turkish navy. And they all prayed, the Catholics prayed the rosary the night before, and they ended up being victorious. What most people don't know is that there was an image of Our Lady of Guadalupe on the flagship of the Christian navy. So she was very much present there. The other thing that happened after that was that Philip II, who, after they were victorious, he took the lantern from the Turkish flagship and he took it back to Spain and brought it to the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Spain. So it's really fascinating when you start seeing all of these things of Our Lady working in different ways across the country to seed new Christians, to transform the world. And I forgot to mention that the 10 million people that were converted by Our Lady of Guadalupe, all of those cultures abandoned polygamy, all the things that they wouldn't do under the Franciscans. Suddenly this image led them to be deeply and truly Catholic and really love our Lord. And in the book, I go into a whole other chapter on the connections with communism and Fatima. It's really amazing to just see these different ways that she's interceded through her images and what it is that she does and has done. And I think that's one of the exciting things, is that Our Lady, she, in a lot of ways, she's not just tearing things down. That we as broken humans, we are the ones that tear things down. She's always building up. And in the year 2015, National Geographic actually called her the most powerful woman in the world, which is really fascinating because, of course, it's National Geographic who was saying that. And that was actually the reason, reading about that was the reason why I ended up writing my next book that came after this book, called The Anti-Mary Exposed, because I thought, if Our Lady is the most powerful woman in the world, what's going on? What happens if Hillary Clinton wins, and it's during the election. And that's what really got me thinking about, well, what about what's happened with elite women in our culture today? We've completely abandoned what it means to be mothers. We've abandoned what it means to cherish our children, to make sacrifices for others. All the things that femininity is so rich in doing. And so that has led me now, this third book is coming out, to really get back to the heart of what it means to be a woman. And I'm certainly happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But I think the important thing is for us to remember with Our Lady is that she can be very effective, she can be very quiet, but she can also do things that are just so rich and mind-blowing and beautiful. And this is why she is the most powerful woman in the world, because if you look at her influence in terms of images, paintings, artwork, architecture, all those Gothic cathedrals, how many of them are named Notre Dame for Our Lady? Musicians, I actually in the book went through and looked at all the different symphonies that were written by different composers over the years, and it's just astounding when you really see how much she's influenced so many of us over the years. Then there's a great quote by Pope Pius X where he says, "If we were to lose Mary, the world would wholly decay. Virtue would disappear, especially holy purity and virginity, connubial love and fidelity. The mystical river through which God's grace flows to us would dry up." And I think it's not too far for us to stretch our imaginations to really see how this has actually happened. We really are drying up those graces because we don't understand virginity, femininity, motherhood, all of those incredible gifts. And by connection, we also don't understand paternity, fatherhood, and the role that men have to play in the culture either. So what then can we do? And in terms of obviously a practical response to all of this, there are the obvious things, prayer, mass, rosary, confession. Marian consecration obviously is, I think, key. So many of us, and probably in this room, our lives changed dramatically with Marian consecration. I ended up writing kind of a companion book to the Marian option, but for children, and it's called Marian Consecration for Children, and it goes, it's 40 days of preparation, and I use a lot of children's books and stories for them to help children really understand Our Lady and go deeper in their own faith. And I'm praying actually that it's kind of like an Amway, like a pyramid scheme, that all these children who have done the Marian consecration through this book somehow, there are graces that I will be getting from it as well. But it's been fantastic to see entire schools, even very lukewarm schools, have been able to do this Marian consecration with their children, and it's just so edifying to see that happen at such a younger age, because I think that's the problem, is we tend to catch people at a much later stage when there's been a lot of damage and people are broken enough that they're like, I need help. But if we could back that up a little bit back to the youth, I think that goes a long way. The second thing that I think we have to do, and I cover this a lot in my next book, is really look at the role of emotions. And I'm speaking here mainly to women, but I think this has a lot of bearing for men, and usually when men hear this, they're like, oh, that makes so much sense. In my research, I've discovered that since the 1890s, the socialists were the first ones to realize that if you make women angry, they will be much more politically effective for you. And you're laughing, but it's because it's true. But what's amazing is that the way that they did it it's probably a term most of those who are my age or older in this room are familiar with, is that idea of consciousness raising. This was invented by a group of socialists, and I read this incidentally in a magazine in the 1890s called Lucifer. And Lucifer went on to change its name to the Journal of Eugenics, is what it changed its name to. So you can see all of those threads going on simultaneously. Yeah, it's not better. But they invented what we know as consciousness raising. And consciousness raising is this idea where you take a bunch of women, you put them in a room, and you have them talk about all the things that upset them. And the intention is not to heal or to bring about some kind of closure or something that's going to leave the better women off better. The idea is that suddenly she's mad about her things, but now she's also mad about all of her friends' things as well. And most people don't realize that this came from the socialists in the 1800s because of the fact that it was sold to Americans in the 60s and 70s as something very important to do, and it was packaged as something from China, that it was this Maoist, Buddhist kind of exercise that you could be involved in. And it's been highly, highly effective. So if you fast forward a little bit, you can see what's happened with American women. Anytime, there's a women's march, these are not happy women. These are very angry, bitter women. And I think it's been very intentional. So instead of faith, hope, and love, we have rage, contempt, and anger, and envy. All of these have really been seeded into the way in which women think and live their lives. The other important piece of this is to recognize the role of what Jordan Peterson calls misplaced compassion. And I first heard about misplaced compassion because Peterson says in his most recent book, We Who Wrestle with God, he talks about Eve's fundamental failure or vice is that she believes her compassion is so big that she can heal things beyond, even things that are sinful that can't be redeemed. She has the capacity to do that. What's fascinating is that Peterson then told me over lunch, he said, you need to read this woman named Esther Harding, and she was a psychiatrist in the 1920s. And so I picked up this book, and I was like, I have no idea why I'm reading this, but because it was really obscure Jungian philosophy, or what's the word? Psychiatry. In any event, I read the book, and in it, I was stopped in my tracks at one point because she talks about this young woman, this is in the 1920s, this young woman that comes into her office and she says, I want to go change the world. And Harding reports this and says, isn't that the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard of a young woman saying, I want to go change the world? And what was striking to me was the realization that this is misplaced compassion that women have absorbed, the sense of, my compassion and my love and my emotions are big enough that I can go out and change the world in sweeping gestures. And I think this is what Peterson meant by misplaced compassion. I think this is Allie Beth Stuckey is another woman. She just published a book called Toxic Empathy. And it's this idea that women believe that their emotions are strong enough that it can change things, especially things that are not even connected to them in any way. So for example, and this, by the way, of course, is the propaganda that's in all of our colleges, is, change the world. It's in all the women that, like myself, who moved to Washington, D.C. with this desire to change the world as young women. But what's amazing about it is, I think of this young woman who works for PETA. She's out there helping animals, and then she's aborting her own child. This is the image and the model of what we have created in young women today. Is this belief that our emotions are so strong and important that we can do things outside of ourselves, and people we've never met, we're going to change the world. And the irony is, of course, is that women are meant for the things that we can hold and we can touch, and the things that are very, very local to us. And it's only when you get the local right that you're going to get the bigger pieces right. And I think this is obviously Mother Teresa is a perfect example of someone who got the local right, and then it was able, her vision and mission were able to go out much bigger. But I actually think it's interesting, and it just occurred to me recently, women have this desire to change things with our emotion, and maybe it was something that we had the capacity to do before the fall. Maybe there was this ability that our emotions were somehow, if they were ordered enough before the fall, that we could do that. But if you look at the Virgin Mary, this is what she does all the time. It's through her love of her children that she does change the world in very specific compelling, beautiful, building, the way a mother changes the world by changing hearts. So I think this is a really important piece in terms of our own families, our children, helping women to begin to understand again how important getting the local right is. And that's where we really have to start. Instead of the abstract people around the world that we think we're helping, we've got to start with the local. The third thing I think we need to do, and this is sort of comes out of this idea of emotions, is to really start getting back to understanding what ordered fruitfulness is. This has been another thing that has been decimated in the culture. This is why we can't define what a woman is, because nobody wants to say a woman is a mother. It's taboo to say that. And the problem is we've also reduced motherhood down to biological motherhood, when in fact all women are called to be mothers. We're all called to nurture, love, care, mentor those around us in our local communities. That's obviously the wonderful thing about having the sisters here, is their model of what that looks like of spiritual motherhood. Motherhood isn't just biological, it's spiritual, it's psychological, it's educational, it's emotional, all of these different ways in which women's gifts are really developed. And instead of that model, what's been supplanted is this vision of womanhood that's supposed to just mimic what men do, and not even good men, because women are supposed to be promiscuous and involved in the occult and have contempt for men. So that we need to start understanding really what fruitfulness is. And of course, people are beginning to pay attention to this now because of the birth dearth. The reason we have all these immigration issues is because native populations of women have not had children in Europe and the United States. If we were not aborting between 40 or 70 million children a year in the world, and these are numbers from the Guttmacher Institute, not at all a conservative organization, we wouldn't be in these situations. We wouldn't have to be moving enormous amounts of people from one population group to the other. So we've definitely created this situation for ourselves. But we also have to understand what fruitfulness means for those who are not able to have children, or those who are single. There's a great book by Bishop Eric Varden, it's called Chastity. And I read it recently, and he has this one line in it that was just so compelling, because there was an older monk that came to him when he became a priest and said, make sure that your celibacy is fruitful. And just that dynamic of, well, that like throws the idea of celibacy on its head. Well, what does fruitfulness mean if you're a celibate man or a celibate woman? What does it mean to be able to offer yourself in these beautiful ways, and ways that are producing fruit in the culture, beyond working for PETA? So I think that's an important element as well. So in any event, I think all of this is that, we're obviously living in a world that is decaying very, very quickly. And we have the capacity to just sort of go right along with it, to become cynical, to become angry, to become depressed, to allow it to really weigh us down. Or we have the ability to really live with wonder and joy and beauty and goodness, and start carving those things out in our community, start carving them out in our families, really start building again, really being this creative minority. They're not called minorities, they're called creative minorities. And I think that's the exciting stage that we're at, as people are seeing there's enough darkness out there, we need to start bringing in the light. But we're also seeing what happens when people they get too deeply in the anger and bitterness. There's no building that happens in that. And that's really where the power of prayer, the power of adoration, all of those things have the capacity to sort of, it's almost like flush out that bitterness and really fill us with God's joy, beauty, mirth, goodness, all of those things that we need in our lives to be able to push out into the darkness, instead of letting the darkness really ooze into us and absorb us. So in any event, I think this is one of the reasons why a conference like this is so important. We need to be together in this. We need to work with one another. We need to share ideas. We need to encourage each other. We need to love each other. I always feel like when I come to conferences like this, I meet friends I didn't know I had, because there's so many amazing people that God is really stirring up in the world today. And I think it's just a fantastic opportunity for us to meet and begin to work together and see what it is that God wants to do with us, with our lives, and with the connections that we make. So, thank you.